Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of September 7th. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, a Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Good afternoon, Josh.
Hello, good afternoon to you.
Well, in a post-Labor Day weekend podcast, it is, though, I don't know, I don't feel amazingly post-holiday, but that may just be the general state of things, I suppose.
It's like the longest perpetual summer ever. Just keeps, it's September, it just keeps going. I think we're still in the summer, right? I don't know.
Right. Perpetual dog days. So
it's July, right?
Yeah, exactly. So last week we took a first cut at some of the macro level results from the Texas Politics Project poll that we released last week on Thursday. The poll came out just as the legislature was adjourning sine die from the special session, and we spent most of last week talking about the big, the view of things that overall, the kind of overarching view of the political landscape, at least as in public opinion, which, well, I think we've characterized repeatedly as dour, which yes. I think which kind of caught on and I think is about right. And we promised to drill down a little more. So I think for this podcast and for where we are right now, I think the question we ought to dwell on today, or the set of questions, revolve around the legislature, the Texas legislature. What does the poll tell us about the legislative session, how the public views the legislature, and vice versa, how legislative expectations of the public might be playing into the management of the agenda by the governor and by the legislature? So I think the place we need to start, which I think is also part of the answer here, is who's paying attention to the legislature. Now, we get up in the morning and read clips and hang out with people more or less that pay a lot of attention to the legislature, and this is kind of their thing. But that's not true of everybody. That said, we did see when we asked about legislature, about attention to the legislature, and in this poll, the special session, that no small share of people reported paying attention. I guess that's a cosmic characterization, but right? I mean, I was struck by how much attention there was during the summer to this thing.
Right. And the thing is, I mean, that's, relative to our usual expectations, which I think, as you kind of alluded to, and I'll say, explicitly, is we generally don't expect people to pay a ton of attention to the legislature. We kind of expect them to pick up, some of the high level happenings. If there's a big fight over something, whether it be abortion rights or what have you, we expect there to be a little bit of an uptick in tension. But we asked throughout the session, how much attention people are paying to the legislature. And, usually when people say, when we ask that, maybe about 10% say a lot, maybe as high as, 15 or 18% say a lot. But when we asked in this most recent poll in August about attention to the current special session of the legislature, 36% said a lot, with another 38% saying some. So even though, a third doesn't sound like a lot, saying they're paying a lot of attention, actually, it kind of is, in terms of what we would normally expect, and especially during the middle of the summer when people generally are expected to tune politics out for the large part and go do other things.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me about this is we drilled down is that there's, I'm not surprised by the fact that there's not much difference between Democrats and Republicans. And I think we'll wind up coming back to this, but independents were, to me, surprisingly likely to say they had heard some or a lot about the current special session. And that's definitely higher than normal.
Right. And the reason that, that stands out is because, if you're someone who's listening to this and you consider yourself a true political independent, you don't lean towards one part or the other, I'm sure that you're obviously paying a lot of attention. You're listening to this podcast, but you are an outlier. And most independents and most true independents, people without partisan attachments, tend to be less engaged in politics, pay less attention, know less of what's going on. So when, from an attention standpoint, when the independents look like partisans, it kind of raises a flag and says, oh, this is really actually breaking through in some general sense.
And then if we add to that, then, so if we set if we acknowledge then, or, we sort of, seem to think based on the data anyway, that more people were paying attention, there's also another interesting thing that was in the poll in terms of the legislature, that was the legislative approval level, which we tend to expect is not very high, but was pretty dismal this time.
Yeah, I would say historically dismal, right? So overall, 28% of Texans in this most recent poll said they approve of the job the legislature is doing. 48% that said they disapprove. So that's net minus 20. That's the highest disapproval and the lowest net approval rating that we have on record. And we usually, assess this pretty regularly after legislative sessions.
That's 4 or 5 sessions worth of data. Yeah.
Right. But also, since June, disapproval of the legislature has gone up. So it's gone up 10 points since we asked just at the end of the session to August. Approval went down 7 points. And the truth is, this was across the board. So we can't exactly, so it's not like we can say, oh, well, this is just Democrats, or this is just, whatever, fill in your group. Back in June, it was 35 approved, 38 disapproved. So almost even. Republicans went from 61 approving to 50 approving, and from 15% disapproving to 27. So almost double the share of Republicans disapproving. Democratic disapproval obviously went up as well, from 65 to 73%, but that's relatively actual minimal compared to the increase in Republican disapproval. Independent disapproval went from 39% in June to 51%. So a majority of independents disapproved. And so really this is sort of, an across-board thing. If you go back to the conversation we had last week about the 30,000 foot view of all of this, and sort of, how are people in general interpreting what looks like dysfunction, in one way or another. It seems that people were in fact interpreting some kind of dysfunction, which isn't to say, again, that there's a direction here about the nature of it. It's possible that some of these Republicans were disapproving because the legislature wasn't accomplishing what they said they were going to. And if we measure again, their approval might bounce back when we measure again next time we go into the field. But needless to say, all of the infighting and consternation and difficulties didn't lead people to think, the legislature is doing a good job. And, if anything, it went in the opposite direction.
Well, and I think one of the things we know, as you drill down into the internals of that, one of the things that's interesting is that even among Republicans, to use a phrase we deploy every so often, it's a certain amount of damning with faint praise. Only 13% of Republicans approved strongly of the job that the legislature was doing. You mentioned that 50% figure. The other 30%, 37% only approved somewhat. And, I think that is striking to me, to the extent that a big part of the discussion that is going on right now is how, everything that was done in the legislature was done to please Republicans and to please Republican primary voters. And while we see some other indications that might be the case, if you break it down by intensity of party identification, the approved strongly, 19% of those who say they're strong Republicans say that they approve strongly. That's a lot, higher than the others, but it's still not very high for a model of government that we're all talking about seems to be moving, as we said last week, almost towards a responsible party model of governance, in the sense that, the agenda is being set and policies are being pursued by and large to appeal to the majority party, with scant regard for the minority party. And the minority, that's showing up in the minority party numbers, and that 53%, more than half of Democrats, disapprove strongly of what the job the legislature is doing. But you're not getting that level of return among Republicans. Now we can, stray back into the negative partisanship piece of this, and that could explain part of this. But I think if you're a Republican and you're looking at these numbers, it's fair to ask, well, what what else should we do? Or are we doing something wrong and not knowing it?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, or are we trying to do too much? I mean, I think one of the, and this is one of the difficulties in writing a poll like this and interpreting, results even at a high level like this is that, it requires a certain amount of guesswork as to what exactly is driving these changes in attitudes, right? And when you start to, ask that question, I mean, you've already kind of set it up, which is, well, it could be a number of things, right? I mean,
lucky for us.
Yes.
We did, in fact, ask people how much they had heard about a bunch of items in the news. And, and this was kind of a mixture of news stories and explicit agenda items, most of which, though, revolved around what was going on with Texas state government and certainly what was in front of the legislature. And we did see a lot of variance in there that maybe does help us work through some of this, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we started talking last week about the 30,000-foot view, and I think over the last couple of podcasts, we've talked about, the breadth and range of conflicts that were taking place in state government, both, between the parties, but also, within the institution, between the chambers, within the parties themselves, amongst Democrats and amongst Republicans, between state and local governments and school districts. And ultimately, there's a lot of places that, a consumer of political information could turn their attention. And it wasn't exactly clear to us what all people were paying attention to. And that's why we set up this battery that includes things like, both the governor's executive orders to prohibit business, basically local governments from instituting business limits, his executive order prohibiting local governments from instituting mask requirements, the veto of the legislative funding, the Democrats leaving the state to deny a quorum, the governor's promise to call multiple special sessions, new legislation on voting elections, the border wall. And you see, as I start going through this list, it's like, oh my God, it's like, yeah, exactly. And for most people, this is kind of overwhelming. But, to the extent that people were paying attention, what really seemed to move to the top of the list was sort of two items kind of stood out from the rest, which was, the Democrats leaving and breaking the quorum. So 63% of Texans said that they'd heard a lot about that, which is not surprising given how much attention the Democrats, sought in doing that. And the other one that was almost even was Governor Abbott's decision to prohibit local governments from instituting mask mandates. That was 62% of people had heard a lot. And, in the case of mask mandates, more Democrats and Republicans had heard a lot about it. 72% of Democrats, 57% of Republicans. Slightly more Republicans had heard a lot about the Democrats leaving. And then, the other issues certainly generated a fair amount of attention. But just to pause on those two for a second, it's interesting to note that, you can almost imagine a counterfactual universe in which, the governor doesn't pick a fight with local school districts over masks. And the leading story right now is the Democrats leaving the state and denying the quorum. And based on the other results we have in the poll, that probably would have been beneficial to Republicans just to keep that issue on front, I think.
Well, we've talked about that and I've thought about it a little bit more. And I think that's probably right. But the more I think about the counterfactual of that, a universe in which, and this is probably a straw man in the other direction, but say the governor, didn't issue an executive order prohibiting mask mandates in schools and left it up to the schools with the idea that, hey, the Democrats, leaving the state and busting quorum is going to lead the political world, is going to lead the political news and occupy the political world. But it's possible that another story would have arisen from him allowing schools to do that. And that would have been the pushback from his own constituents saying, hey, how come you're not preventing them from doing this? Which is an expectation that at this point in time, he's cultivated, right? I mean, he spent much of to be fair, he spent the second half of 2020 trying to clamp down on local governments and school districts' ability to make their own policy. And then when the Delta variant came and schools started making their own and he didn't do anything, pretty likely that was we probably would have had, the same kind of conflicts that we've talked about on the podcast and that everybody listening has seen of, fist fights and yelling and stuff at the schools. So I'm not, so I don't know. I mean, we talked about that. And the more I've thought about it, I'm not sure that he wasn't a little more boxed in than that. Not that that's to say, that's not to pass judgment on the wisdom of the policy in either direction, although, but, I do wonder, how, if it wouldn't have like happened in a different way.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, this is where it's kind of, this is where I think one of the difficult things that, that it's really hard.
He's a certain member of, how many masked angels dance on the head of a pen, but.
Well, this is one of those things where, even, studying public opinion and studying it closely, you're somewhat left at a bit of a loss because a lot of times we can measure the direction of opinions and to some extent we can measure the intensity. But, another sort of way to think about, people's opinions is sort of the centrality of it or the salience of it, which is, relative to all the other things that they're thinking about, how much are they thinking about this?
Yeah.
Right. Or how, relative to all the other things they can think about, how important is this or how primary is this thing when they then go and evaluate, the politicians and the parties and the role of government. And I think that's part of what's difficult to unpack, even in this very, very information filled poll, is that, you look at this and you say, yeah, that's right. I agree with you. But then when we look at, some of the items down the list where we ask people whether they approve or disapprove of some of these things that we're talking about here, and we ask about local government efforts to slow, the coronavirus or local ISD measures to slow COVID in schools, you have 87 or 84% of Democrats in favor of those things, but you also have about 35% of Republicans in favor of what the local governments and local ISDs are doing. And that's where the difficulty comes in. So you have about a majority of Republicans who are on board with what Abbott is doing. Now, the question is, do they hold those opinions really closely? Are they super important? Is making sure that kids don't wear masks or don't have to wear masks in school central to, how they're evaluating candidates right now? And, or is that more likely to be the case for the 34% of Republicans who are kind of like, hey, wait a minute, I just want to,
But it's difficult because, as you've said, like repeatedly, particularly on this mask wearing and the school thing, there's a lot of cross pressures here because in that same reading, 34% approve of school districts of Republicans approve of school districts implementing measures to slow the virus, as you were saying, but 75% approve of Governor Abbott's executive order prohibiting local government. So there's a couple things about that. One, obviously, there's some movement there. I think that, that as you point out frequently has to do with kids.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, the 75 and 34 don't add up to 110. Yeah. So somebody's moving because of the school piece. But to the point of, had Governor Abbott not issued that executive order, I'm pretty confident a big share of those 75% of Republicans may well have noticed. But this gets back to another complicated thing about public opinion. At this point, I think they don't need Greg Abbott to lead them to that position, but it's going to be a lot easier to get to that position if Greg Abbott acts.
Yeah, I think the other side to the way that you frame that in terms of the question is to say, and then for that, again, exactly, those numbers don't add up to 100%. And the point is, but one question is asking, hey, it's basically if you take a step back and kind of just look at these in isolation, one is basically saying, this is how I think of people in Germany is, hey, do you think, the schools should be doing what they can and, under the best wisdom they have to keep kids safe? And the reality is most people would say, yeah, I think so. And then again, with Republicans, it's more complicated because of the politics of this, what have you. But ultimately, there's a fair number of people who'd say yes. When we say, hey, do you think Greg Abbott should be, making an executive order that lays out clearly what the districts can and can't do, let's just say in the most anodyne way possible, partisanship plays a big role in that. And ultimately, if you look across all these items, if we include Greg Abbott in the STEM, that's a cue to Republican voters that I probably agree with this, even if I'm not sure. It's a nudge in that direction. And so I think, that's part of the difficulty. It's part of, it's both the promise and the peril of what Abbott's doing right now. There was an article in the Trib today that I thought was pretty good and kind of pointed out something that I've been thinking about a lot, which is, it seemed like the legislature was kind of keeping their hands off this issue as much as they could. And, the Tribune article basically made the point, yes, they directly did that. They chose not to get in the middle of this fight between the governor and school districts on masks, because honestly, who wants to be in that fight? I don't think anybody.
And I think that, and there are two institutional things that are interesting there, right? One is, I guess these are two sides of the same thing, but, an example of the legislature looking at the politics of this, knowing, that they're, to the extent that they're going to benefit from this, they can let Governor Abbott take whatever backlash there is, in terms of at the individual decision-making level, but how that all aggregates into the legislature ultimately dominated by a Republican majority, ceding authority to a Republican-led executive. And I think this is one of the things that is, driving, some people, internal to the legislature kind of crazy. But it's more old timers and staff people rather than the elected officials who are, the agents of this, of this ceding of authority. Right.
But this is why, I still kind of go back to the counterfactual. I mean, what you're talking about at that point is a really, an interinstitutional kind of like, historical argument about, the manifestation of mask mandates and all that. But when I think about, the counterfactual about the Democrats leaving, it was to do what? It was to stop Republicans from passing, on their construction of the story, it was to stop Republicans from passing, restrictive voting legislation.
Right.
Ultimately, that voting legislation was overwhelmingly supported and wanted by Republican voters, much less conflict there than in other places. And truthfully, for most of the issues that Republicans were addressing, in addition to voting legislation, they know they have strong constituencies for, stricter restrictions on abortion. They know they have strong, constituencies for critical race theory limitations, whatever that means. They know that they have, certainly a very active constituency that wants to limit, basically what transgendered students can do in public life or
Josh, I want to prohibit you from using the term critical race theory in this podcast.
I said whatever
some
that
listeners
means.
Feel uncomfortable.
Well, I said whatever that means. Doesn't that work? Isn't that the same as like a no offense, but I just did it afterwards. So, but the thing is, there are clear constituencies for these things. We know it. We've measured it, time and time again. These things come up. And I would think even some of these fit into these historical contexts, whereas, fighting the pandemic and the pandemic whose on the ground impact is changing, let's say week to week, it's odd to me, again, to shift the conversation to, the governor versus school districts who we generally trust to protect the kids. It's like a basic level. It just seems to me it took a lot of the oxygen out of the room where they could have just been happy saying, hey, look, we're trying to do all this stuff that, our voters who elected us statewide and to a majority in both houses want us to do. And they're keeping us from basically doing the people's business. The mask thing just kind of cuts across that to me in the school district fight and the local government fight, cuts across that in a way that just, I understand that it's probably necessary for Greg Abbott in the Republican primary for sure. But if he got to choose, I think, like it says, it would be clear that if he got to choose, he would much rather be focusing on the voting bill and immigration.
Well, and that's another interesting thing about these numbers is that as salient as immigration is as a problem, when we ask, really at the bottom of the list of how much people have heard a lot about, and, by some small margins, but nonetheless, two of the items are, Governor Abbott's, how much have you heard about Governor Abbott's plan to use state money to essentially build a wall? We didn't use that language. We said to add more barriers, et cetera. Or Governor Abbott's veto, or the number of migrants detained crossing the U.S.-Mexican border. Those were well below a lot of the other items that we tested. They were 8 and 9 of, the 10 that we asked about.
And I think that was surprising. I don't know. We haven't really talked about this.
No, I was surprised by that too. No, we haven't.
The fact that, so 51% of Republicans said that they've heard a lot about the number of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border recently, and this is, again, in a state where without fail, somewhere between 40 and 60% of Republicans regularly say that immigration or border security is the number one issue facing the state. We know that this is a topic that's, regularly discussed on conservative media. The governor has really, made a lot of, effort to talk about the situation at the southern border and to blame, the current administration for it. And so the fact that this number wasn't even higher, given what we know about, Republican attitudes toward immigration. But, maybe the answer is simply the way we started, which is there's a lot going on right now.
Well, although,
it's hard to focus people's attention.
To be fair to our pre-existing expectations,
Oh.
but no, I mean, if you look at break it down by party, Republicans were, significantly more likely than Democrats or independents to have said that they had heard about the number of migrants. 51% of Republicans said they had heard, a lot about it.
Well, and to be fair,
only
that was
37% of independents and 31% of Democrats.
And to be fair, again, saying that, look, there's a fire hose of information right now. That's still fourth highest on the list of the 9 items in terms of the things that Republicans heard about. So the number one was Democrats leaving the state. 68% heard a lot. Abbott's, executive order prohibiting, mask mandates was 57%. Abbott's special session calls was 52, and at 51 was the number of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border.
Right.
So it's not like
it was up there, but I mean, I think it also, I think does underline what we've been saying here in a different way, that the fights over COVID policy and masking, anything that's competing with immigration and border security is really loud in the ears of Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming that, one of the things, or, sort of fleshing out the fact that one of the things we're seeing here is that, we think about this environment and about what's salient to people. And even when we ask people, how much have you heard? People are hearing different things.
Yeah.
They're these things have very different weights. So, I think that as we look at this, to step back to another kind of broad view of this, there's a lot of interesting data here to me that I'm still kind of processing in a lot of ways about just where the legislature is in the real estate of Texans. And, and I ask that now. Normally what I would think is, there's been a couple of special sessions and they've paid attention to all this stuff because it's been very conflictual. And as you say, it's been a very crowded environment. And then people are turning on the local news and seeing stuff about the legislature as first, second, third story before the first commercial break. And so they're getting exposed to it. And normally I think, but now it's kind of over, but we're going to have yet another session. And they're going to be back in less than 2 weeks by, rumor at this point, if not, official pronouncement, to do redistricting. And I think there's every expectation, as we had sort of discussed on here 2-3 weeks ago, that it will not just be a redistricting session, that there will be other things added to that session. And so, it's interesting to me to see that the legislature is becoming, is likely to retain a certain level of salience. We also saw that people said that they were hearing more about redistricting, which is going to be the focus of this. At a moment when, on the pointy-headed side or on the insidery side, we're paying a lot of attention to what looks like the declining power of the legislature within the institutional arrangements of Texas politics, situated within, the partisan universe right now. That, right. It's a tough break for not that I feel sorry for them, but it's a funny, tough break for the legislature that, they're going to have a lot of eyes on them again at just the moment that they're really not at their best, to understate the case.
We'd had this conversation like a couple months back where, I'd sort of raised this sort of speculative thing. And I was thinking, we asked this question about the Texas model of government and whether it's a good model for other states to follow. And part of, what is the Texas model? It's like, well, we always think it's a low taxes, low services model. So we're trying, it's a small government model. And part of that is the legislature convening for 140 days every 2 years, which whenever I tell someone not from the state or sometimes even reporters, remind them of this fact or let them know for the first time, they're shocked that a state as large as Texas has this part-time legislature. But it's part of the set piece. And one of the things that I've, having been here a while and, done all this public opinion, you come to realize that, the things that people have internalized are internalized. And so one of the things I was sort of wondering about through all this is the way you put that, I think is great, is like, well, at what point does our 140-day part-time legislature start to look like a full-time legislature that nobody wants? Right. And I don't mean that as a comment on this legislature per se. I just mean it as a comment on the form of
they're doing their part.
Well, I'm just saying that's just me saying that. I'm not personally.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
But I like to be fair.
Well, and I think you're right. And I think that, it's also good to look back and parse the way that this question has been phrased for the decade we've been asking it, which is, generally speaking, how do you feel about, do you essentially agree or disagree with the following statement? Generally speaking, the way state government runs in Texas serves as a good model for other states to follow. And, what's interesting is what I was thinking is when you said, when we think about what people are thinking, they're thinking about low service, low tax, low service model. I don't think that's what's coming to mind first for a lot of people right now.
Not right now. Well, and that's the thing, though. And I mean, and actually, I'm glad you brought up the specific wording because, I mean, if you even think about it, I mean, the way you just phrased that, right, is that you go back and you say, yeah, we're in a moment when, like, it seems like the legislative branch is in a bit of decline, yet it's happening when they've basically been in session since the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
Right. But you are talking about, a version of Texas government where, the question is great, which is, is it a good model for others to run and to follow? And if you think about right now, what we've been witnessing over the last few months, it'd be hard for anyone, Democrat or Republican, to say, yeah, this is pretty good. This is working well.
And yet 26% strongly agreed.
Well, yeah. As I said,
including almost half of Republicans. And 75% of Republicans still say yes. But that also, and so what that underlines is that, the part of this question that invites projection, or at least, a projection onto the phrasing of the question, begs the question of not only has the content of what people read into the question changed, but of the criteria of, are the criteria that people are using in their own evaluations, how much has that changed? And it points us to that question that I think we need to, probably, engage soon and maybe on the podcast, which is, what is it to be a Texas Republican right now? Which ultimately gets to the question that has come up a lot in a lot of different settings right now is, well, people would say, hey, look, if you're the first thing people are going to say, if you're a Texas Republican, you're conservative. Well, that doesn't help.
Yeah, I was going to say, what is it, meaning what?
Exactly.
Conservative
and
how?
And I think that's a huge question right now because I think, in terms of looking at how the sausage gets made around here. I mean, I've had this title, in my mind for a few weeks now, which is, the reactionary moment in Texas.
Yeah. I mean, to assume, ideology is a very complicated construct. And, to the extent that like ideology exists in any sort of real and meaningful way, I think it's a lot easier to say that it exists amongst the elected officials than it does in the electorate in some clear and consistent way. However, to the extent that the last decade plus, I'm not even putting this in the last year, this is sort of a long-term, I think, trend here. But to the extent that, we've seen, numerous instances in which, what we think of as ideology sort of ignored or subverted or somehow.
Well, it's changed.
Or change. But that's the thing. Well, I mean, the only reason I resist change is because it requires an adherence to the idea of ideology or a new definition of what the ideology is for it to actually apply across domains and time in some sort of way. I mean, at this point, the idea I would say is I'm reluctant to use the word ideology because you usually think about, a consistent set of there's a lot of definitions. The definition I prefer because Jim and I could get into this. The definition I prefer is, some sort of an abstract worldview that allows for a consistent set of preferences across time and space, right?
I was going to preface this discussion by saying, I don't think we have the same definition of ideology.
I know we don't.
But let's go on.
I know we don't have the same definition of ideology, but generally, I think you could witness, ideology as defined in any number of ways. In the legislature, I think amongst the members who are professional politicians and political actors who have to think about these things a lot, right? Whereas, the electorate, somewhat. Whereas now it just sort of seems to be totally broken down. So the thing is, would you say, when Texas goes and increases its border security funding, on an issue that's a federal issue to, 3 times what it used to spend and, almost $2 billion, it's like, so is that fiscally conservative? It's like, well, I don't, I guess, I don't know, but it's what people want. And that's the other thing that I think we've noticed in the last couple of years. We asked a lot of questions in the last, 5-10 years about, kind of trying to probe at this idea of local control, state government, blah, blah, blah. Point being, people want what they want. And the idea that ordinary citizens have some sort of an abstract view about, proper government roles and power and stuff like that is just, it doesn't really bear out in the data most of the time. But what you do find is that they want the policies they want. And so, to your point here, on the one hand, the sort of the Texas model is definitely seems to be changing in some ways. But ultimately, if you're a voter and you're getting what you want, are you happy with the way it's working? Well, yeah, sure. I'm getting what I want. So you can still have 75% of Republicans in favor of a limited government model that's running all year.
Yeah. Well, the trick is I think is understanding, how it is that those underlying definitions, how people ideologically frame as ideology what they want, what affects the changes in that, because I think what we're really seeing now in this very moment is how much those things can move around and be shaped by, a bunch of different factors that are, structural / contextual and are flexible and are, and change. And I think it brings us back to something we've said, numerous times recently, which is that, Donald Trump really shifted the content, the ideological content and the agenda of the Republican Party a lot in a way that I think reflects the notion of ideology we deploy in public opinion polling anyway.
And to be
it's not completely different, but I mean, priorities and the various weights and valences have changed.
Yeah, and I think to be fair and to acknowledge something too, it also changed the way the Democrats think about ideology.
Yeah, I was going to. Yeah,
I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah,
too.
no,
So
that was going to be. It moved things, and we've seen that in Texas, and we've talked about it. And so, what that means for the legislature now, I think, is the kind of instability and in some cases both political, ideological, and practical gymnastics that we've seen in the legislature to make this all, sort of cohere in a way that I'm not sure as we look at these numbers, is only working unevenly and sets the stage for the coming year, for the politics in an election year in a way that I think is going to create a lot of uncertainty for both Republican and Democratic candidates because that universe has become so scrambled and less reliable. Right. I mean, the same dynamic that says, hey, people may be thinking about like what a good model for government is differently than they used to 5 years ago or 10 years ago when we started asking this question. And, that's a pretty big element of uncertainty. And so you look for certainties, and that may be part of why we saw some of the impulses that we saw in the legislature and some of the legislation. But there are, I think probably institutional factors that also made that maybe not go exactly according to plan or, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you explain us being in a position right now where the state has, all but outlawed abortion or at least all but abolished it. If not, I'm sure Brian Hughes was with us on the podcast. He said, well, look, we didn't make it illegal. We just, created mechanisms for people who object to it to stop it.
Right.
To take that at face value. But nonetheless, there's certainly no lack of Republicans right now. I mean, it's muted, but they're out there saying, I'm not sure this is going to work out exactly the way we expected it to. Now, we'll see.
That's an interesting thing. I mean, I've been hearing my whole life since I was at least, politically cognizant, and that's the word I used when I became politically cognizant.
Mm-hmm. You probably used it at the time. Yeah.
At the time, yeah, when I was like 11, I said, I think I'm politically cognizant now. But anyway, we've heard for years that look, when abortion gets outlawed, you're going to see a big shift in the electorate. You're going to see a bunch of people who hadn't thought this was an issue, who thought that was settled, wake up, and I'm shrugging my shoulders right now because we'll see, but it's going to be tested. And that's kind of, the interesting issue here is that, as much as, the way this session has played out will allow for Republicans, to pick and choose when they go back to their primary electorate, what they want to talk about. They don't get to choose what Democrats want to talk about. And they don't get to choose what their challengers are going to talk about. And the truth is, just as much as there's a bunch of issues that I think Republicans can look, basically point to their electorate and say, see, we did what you want. Democrats also have a bunch of issues to turn to. And when I look through this poll, it's notable, one, the unanimity and extremity of Democratic opposition to most of the things that Republicans have done. And this goes over the course of our polling during the session. And it's not like, it's not like there's a lot of daylight there. We're talking 70, 80, 90% of strong opposition in most cases among Democrats. Amongst Republicans, there's some issues that generate more support than others. They're all generating majority support. But there's plenty of issues that we're kind of seeing that there's a third of Republicans who are not into it. Or more importantly, I think there's a majority of independents who don't think we should, let's say, have permitless carry. And so, just as, so all this activity, it is really allowing for, in some ways it's interesting. It's endogenous to, the political competition in the state, right? We see more competition. So we're seeing, if anything, the first round of that was Republicans really focusing on bread and butter issues. We've come back around to the second round of it. Now Republicans are really focusing on their Republican voters and Republican primary voters. And so, this next round of this is to see, well, what do the Democrats do? And does it matter? Does any of it matter? But there's a lot of possibilities when you say it. Part of it is I don't think it's about it all mattering. It's about what is the, what do the elections and campaign actually coalesce around, and what do the candidates focus on, and what impact does that have? And
I think the question, that we've sort of engaged today is going to be part of that. But I wonder if it won't, we'll have to keep an eye on it as the primaries and as election season unfolds, should the legislative session ever end. Which is, how did the institutional dynamics feed that? Because, the legislature is one of the key places where, at least per initial design, that's supposed to check some of those impulses, and not to sound like an old timer, but, if we had an old timer on the podcast right now, they'd be saying, yeah, look, it was the job of the state affairs chairman to not let that happen on the abortion issue. If you want to put some limits on abortion, we're all, but, this other stuff, it's the job to have those, those big late night hearings, and then to not keep that stuff bottled up or slowed down in a way that we're not in this position. Now, I think a generation of activists and Republicans and conservatives, could say from their perspective, and, not questioning their perspective, well, that's what was bad about that system. But I think the election is going to test that theory, as you're saying. It's not going to be a conclusive test, because the context of the Democrats being so weak is not affects that as a test of that theory. But nonetheless, this has been an interesting moment for seeing how institutional performance, or, changes in the relative powers between different branches and different centers of power in the political system affects that. So I think with that, we've gone a little over. I want to thank Josh for being here and a good, rousing discussion about the Texas Legislature. Thanks to our crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. You can find the data from the latest Texas Politics Project poll that we've been discussing, and much, much more, as always, at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. I'd say go to the latest poll page first, but you can also go to our polling archive to get not only documentation, summaries and crosstabs, but also the data file and the code book for the poll. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.